My name is Daniel Fisher, and I'm a person with lived experience of my own recovery from schizophrenia. And I also am a psychiatrist. I've worked doing community psychiatry for 40 years. And I want to describe now where emotional CPR came from, what emotional CPR is. Emotional CPR is our way of teaching people to help other people through a difficult time, through distress. And it's analogous to CPR, where a person's physical heart has stopped beating. At times, especially in this period of COVID, our emotional heart needs to be resuscitated. And that's what we teach in emotional CPR, although it's really intrinsic in each person to be able to help another person. And where did it come from? Well, it came from my and other people's lived experience of recovery from severe emotional distress. And it really is the embodiment of what we most wanted from another person when we were in emotional distress. And I'll briefly say that for myself, I went through a period in my 20s on 3 different occasions when I stopped going to work. I was a biochemist at the time. I stopped speaking. I even stopped eating. It was a life-threatening situation. And I was really in a struggle as to whether I wanted to continue to live the kind of life that I've been living, which was really for other people, not for myself. Very inauthentic. I just knew what other people wanted, and I just gave them what they wanted. I had no idea who I was. And I think my inner self just said, stop, you have to pause. Luckily, I found in one of the hospitals especially, 2 corpsmen. It was a Navy hospital, and they were able to reach me. They didn't have a lot of formal training, a lot of formal clinical training, which probably was a good thing, because unfortunately, a lot of clinical training and a lot of over-reliance on medication can short-circuit the relationship, can interfere with the connection that you need. And I'm not opposed to medication, but it should come late in your connecting process with another person. And these 2 corpsmen, I wish I could find them. One was named Tori, and the other was John. And they did what no one else could do. They reached me. And on one occasion, in fact, I was just stationary and staring straight ahead. And they had tried injecting me with medicine. They had tried giving me smelling salts, all kinds of things. And one of them, one of the corpsmen just came and looked at me, and looked at me, and looked at me. And I realized for the first time somebody actually was taking an interest in me as a person. And it wasn't just there to fill out a form or ask a set of questions. And he said, if you can hear me, just nod. And I nodded. And that was my first sort of step back into the world. And I thought at the time, if other people had been through what I was going through, they'd know just to be with me, not to try to fix me, not to try to give a plan for me, and not to judge me, but just to be present with me. And that, I would say, for myself, was the beginning of thinking about what was to become emotional CPR 30 years later. Emotional CPR is a way of reaching people in distress. And just as those corpsmen had reached me, I'm now trying to find ways to teach other people to reach a person in distress. And we have the C and the P and the R. And they're not exactly linear, but we try to cover each of them. And the C is for connecting, especially at a heart-to-heart level. And we encourage, in fact, not overly relying on words, but to be with the person and be with them non-verbally as much as verbally. Their facial expression, their posture, but especially to be aware of one's own posture, one's own feelings inside. And the big difference between emotional CPR and a more clinical approach is that we encourage the person who's assisting to share some feeling that they're having in being with the person in distress. And somehow this gives the person in distress a feeling of more safety, a feeling of almost permission to share their own feelings. And this is very different in traditional training. Therapists is taught to keep their feelings to themselves. But actually, when you're in severe distress, you want to know there's another human being there. You want to know that they're with you and that they care at some level about you, especially the you that's not expressing itself just in your head. The P is for empower. We cheated a little bit. The P is not right at the very beginning. But by empowerment, we really mean expressing of your own feelings, because our power comes from the expression of our feelings. And it's once we're able to express a whole range of our feelings, our sadness, our fears, our anger, our happiness, our joys, the more of those that we can express, the more power that we have in our own life. The better decisions that we can make, because we know what resonates and what gives us a positive feeling. We know relationships that we're working for or aren't working for us. And so the R is, we didn't say recovery, because this isn't just for people who've been labeled with a mental illness, it's for the entire population. So R is revitalize, bring back to life. Because when you feel a connection with another person and you experience your own feelings, you come back to life. And that's revitalization. It's not a tool for your toolkit, because it isn't something, we don't have a cookbook that says do A and do B and do C. We do have intentions, which we'll get into, but they're not rules that you strictly have to follow, because it's important for you to make it your own, to be authentic as possible yourself when you're with another person. And we can't teach each person just how to be authentic. But we do is we give people permission and some clues about how to experience themselves, how to experience being with another person. So it's a way of being more than it is a way of doing. Emotional CPR is for everyone, just as CPR is for everyone. And we make it as accessible as possible, regardless of a person's education background. And in fact, although clinicians often at times find it useful, it is harder somewhat for clinicians to learn this, because they have to do some unlearning. Unfortunately, clinicians, as I mentioned earlier, have been taught not to share feelings. Whereas people who are providing support, like home care or first responders or people that are not as clinically oriented, they have a human response. That's more automatic. I think also people get a lot of emotional CPR from animals, dogs, cats. They often are service animals, and I think the reason is that they respond right away. It's very important to respond. I'll say a word about that. It's been shown with babies that if the mother, and it's sort of a mean experiment to do, but the mother is gazing at their baby, could be the father, but it happens to be the mother, and for 30 seconds shows no expression, the baby automatically starts to cry. So the interplay of feelings between people starts as a survival. That's our survival right from the beginning, right at birth. Our philosophy behind emotional CPR is that most emotional problems, most mental health conditions, in one way or another, are the result of trauma. And there are a variety of ways that people can experience trauma. Usually people think of physical or sexual trauma, but economic trauma, racial trauma, the trauma of being homeless, the trauma of being in a strange land, the trauma of rejection. There's so many different forms that it can take. So we focus very much on what does trauma do? And trauma creates a fight, flight, or freeze response in the person. And in many of these conditions, there's also a numbing that goes on of your feelings, and there's a tendency of people to isolate, separate. Sometimes they move against people, but not to be able to connect. There's generally a disconnect and an alienation. And also people feel helpless often, or hopeless after trauma. And it happened to me. I was traumatized when I was 10 years old by a teacher, and I was sexually abused. And I think part of my recovery from what was described as schizophrenia was a recovery from that trauma, because that left me afraid of people. It left me feeling like, what are they thinking about? And that made me want to please even more and really get the approval of other people. I had to really accept I went through the trauma, but I'm still here, I'm still alive. And so the three major impacts of trauma are disconnection and alienation, secondly, a sense of disempowerment, and third, an emotional numbing. And emotional CPR addresses the disconnection by emphasizing, especially connection at a heart-to-heart level. It addresses the disempowerment and the helplessness by helping a person to experience their emotional power. And it helps with the emotional numbing because it brings back a sense of feeling, a sense of vitality. That's the revitalization. Emotional CPR really takes place in four different levels. And we started, the first level that we started with historically was a dyad, one-on-one. How does one person assist another? The more we practice eCPR, the more we realized how important it is to practice eCPR with oneself. So, what am I feeling at this time? What's my body telling me about my own feelings? And how can I express those to myself even? And we call this me CPR. And this self-care is very important. And mindfulness can be very helpful, for instance, and it is very good preparation for eCPR is the me CPR, taking care of oneself, and one's own body, and one's own mind. Then we realize, well, when we're together and we do the training with 12 participants and 2 to 4 different trainers, we have a group. And that group we want to attend to very much. Right from the start, we realize that the connections between the group members are a very, very important part of the learning process. And we call that we CPR. So that's where we practice the principles, the intentions, emotional CPR with each other. So we're trying to be authentic as possible. We're trying to really be on the same wavelength and really feel when we're speaking. Our hope in the future, a dream that we have, those of us that do emotional CPR especially, is that it will become as widespread and well-known as CPR. And in so doing, it will prevent many of the emotional crises that people go through and will decrease the pressure on emergency rooms, the pressure on psychiatric hospitalization, and especially important in this period of COVID-19, where you can't just diagnose and treat. We're in a disaster. We're in a community-wide crisis. And at times like that, I worked, for instance, in New Orleans after Katrina. There were 900,000 people that were experiencing a great deal of distress. And I contacted the Red Cross and said, I want to come down and help out. I'm a psychiatrist. And they said, well, we don't want psychiatrists. And I said, well, I'm also a peer. And oh, they said, fine. Fine. I said, and I can come down and I can teach other peers how to assist. That was 2005, and that was really sort of a prototype of emotional CPR because we didn't have the program yet. But our hope and our dream is that we'll have community CPR, that everyone will be able to practice it.